So you assess that it's important for us to be alert to efforts by others to undermine social cohesion in Singapore. And you've listed some possible others. This includes foreign governments and ideologically driven groups.
That's right.
So you go on to suggest that there are some countermeasures, sufficient legislation to curb the exposure of Singaporeans to such falsehoods. This is page 5 in your second last paragraph. To allow Singapore to counter targeted campaigns against social trust. And you, page 6, if you turn over the first paragraph, you propose a mechanism to empower the government to stop access to media sites that carry deliberate online falsehoods which can threaten Singapore's social harmony. And that this mechanism should kick in quickly. You presume quickly from when the falsehood is
actually put up.
And since some sites might be based overseas, there must be adequate provision to block these sites if it is deemed as necessary.
That's right.
You go on to suggest that an independent committee should hear appeals to remove the bans of such sites if the owners of such websites contest their ban. Do you have views on what this independent committee might look like?
I think one is, of course, it should have experts from different fields and different areas so that we can have a kind of balanced look at it. I think in general, I mean, if it's a concerted effort by a foreign power, for instance, I think to me, I think it's quite obvious that I think most people would agree that we should just ban those, insidious kind of attacks. I think sometimes when it's in a grey site, I think you want to have independent-minded people so that there will be no contest that there's an attempt to stop free speech if people look at this as being a free speech issue. So then I think you want to have a kind of good mix. But I say that this should only be used, this should be used as a way to contest. So, and I assume that if somebody's working from Macedonia or Russia or some other place, and if they put up such things, I don't think they will want to contest it. There's a little point for that. But I guess in some situations where people felt it was a credible kind of story and the government or whatever ministry or whatever agency was blocking it, was doing it too rashly, then I think it's important for an independent committee to weigh on this.
So your position is that such a committee need not apply itself to every instance of deliberate online falsehoods, that there would be some threshold or test under which this committee's work would be necessary, and in other circumstances it would not be necessary.
Yes.
Do you foresee that potentially the courts could play the role of this independent committee?
I'm not legally trained to make that a point, but I'm wondering about of course, I think the issue is it's about a question about the level of a potential harm. I'm talking about very contested type of
I understand.
statements. Yeah.
So that was the first point, that you would need some form of process, but it would not need to apply to every single instance of deliberate online falsehood. That's one issue.
Yes, that's right.
But once you decide that a body needs to deal with deliberate online falsehoods, do you imagine that the courts could play that role?
It's possible. I think courts can call on witnesses and things like that, so depending on how the process is done.
So the courts could call witnesses and also has recourse to bring in experts and make some sort of deliberation. You've also, in page 6 on your third paragraph, suggested possible mandatory training for people who share articles which are actually false. What type of training do you have in mind?
Well, I think the exact level of it, I'm coming from the fact that at some stage there needs to be some discipline when it comes to passing information. And of course, the latest MIT study and others do know that when you pass on information, it can go in a vengeance, especially if something triggers one's emotion. You can see the spread and the potential harm of it can be quite substantial. So in that kind of case, I think it's helpful for people, especially in Singapore, to be responsible about what you post. And so if that's the case, then I think when you post such messages, which you got from somewhere, and it really clearly would threaten some kind of harm, then I think somehow or another somebody needs to, I guess it could be a slew of kinds of education, right? I think the most basic one would be somebody, you get an official letter to tell you that that was a falsehood, and please be reminded, go to this online training process or something like that. I think in some cases, I think depending on the kind of the kind of post which is passed on, I think there might have to be some kind of agency which directly kind of helps people go through a quick process, but important process to help them to understand the gravity of the situation.
And so you're suggesting this for people who have already transgressed by sharing
Yes, that's right.
falsities. Okay. But you then go on in your third last paragraph to suggest that any measure imposed, and I quote, must not have the unintended consequence of stifling potential useful discussion.
Mm-hmm. That's right.
But let's talk a little bit about this. The measure imposed, if the measure imposed was targeted, specific, and effective around a deliberate online falsehood, is there any way that that could stifle potentially useful discussion? Because I put it to you that there's nothing useful about a deliberate online falsehood.
Yeah. This particular paragraph, when I talk about the chilling effect, has got to do with people sharing a particular site, a particular post, for instance. So obviously, you want to chill the people who are responsible for passing off distortions. So you don't want to, there's nothing useful about that. But I guess when somebody shares something, in potentially the kind of situation was maybe a post which said, poor research or maybe false research, but saying that, a particular community in Singapore, a particular migrant community is responsible for particular kinds of crimes or situations like that. And you pass that. Now, sometimes people do have those kind of curiosities, concerns, and rather than them bottling it up and pretending it, and not getting a chance to have it kind of verified or people to argue about it, I think there should be some mechanism by which they would be able to share that in some place. And so that's why I call for some kind of site where you actually can post that up. And in that particular site, you don't get penalized for putting it, but of course then you have people who are able to navigate the discourse and help frame it.
But Dr. Mathews, I put it to you that what you're describing is situations of uncertainty and ambiguity with a question yet to be answered.
That's right.
But my question is not about that. My question is about the deliberate act of spreading a falsehood online. Can there be any need to protect the ability for someone to deliberately spread a known falsehood online in any useful way for our society?
No. There's no need to protect that particular right. So we should not allow people to.
And I'm not sure if you perhaps heard the representation made by Dr. Sun and Dr. Carol Sun in the previous session, that the ability to then spread a deliberate online falsehood actually undermines the effectiveness of our democracy and the effectiveness of trust in free speech. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, that's right.
Okay. And you've talked about the website that you want dedicated websites managed by community agencies in Singapore. Page 6, second paragraph. I'm a bit. Do you mean when you say agencies, this implies a state intervention, but when you say community, it implies a non-state intervention. So are you suggesting a state or a non-state approach?
I'm talking about a non-state agency. I guess the word community agency is.
I see.
Yeah.
But who would then provide the veracity and the backing to the truth of the facts put up by a community agency?
And I think that there definitely needs to be some kind of link and attempt to try to, for that particular, independent group to have some kind of recourse to be able to find out, have some ways to be able to deal with the state, for instance, of get information. But even then, even without, with some things are just very hard to clarify, immediately. So you don't have, depending on the kind of remark that's made, or at least the post, the reading. So for instance, it could be a page set up about ex-overseas Singaporeans or people who used to be migrants here or who are migrants here who are now somewhere else and laughing about Singapore, something like that. And maybe some of these things might be doctored, might be made up. And of course, in this site, there could be people who would be able to help the reader to think through and ask for, is there evidence? Is this logical? Show the other side of it. So that kind of discussion, I think that's what probably needs to be done in such a case.